From Chancellor to Dictator, 1933 to 34. Podcast 2, the Reichstag Fire and the 5th of March elections. So, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor, when he was given the Chancellorship on the 30th of January 1933, he accepted it, but on the condition that the Reichstag be dissolved and that new elections be set. And the date was set for the 5th of March 1933, which was about 5 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor. Why did Hitler want to have elections? Well, because remember, the previous elections, he only had 33% of the support in the Reichstag. So he is a coalition chancellor. He can't pass laws by himself. He needs to be freed up from coalition partners, so at the very least he needs to get a majority. He needs to get 51% or more of the vote, which is why he wanted a new election. He's confident that he can achieve that because, as we saw in the previous podcast, he's got full access to the state radio now, and as Chancellor he's going to get a lot more media exposure. So he'd wasted no time. The 31st of January, the day after he became Chancellor, he used that media. He gave a hugely powerful speech on the German radio called The Appeal to the German People. So make sure you learn that date and you learn the name of that speech. It's an important fact to include in your answers. What did he say in this speech? Okay, well, nothing about what he eventually wanted to do. He put out of your mind what we know that Hitler became. We know that he wanted to go to war against Russia. The German people did not want a leader who would take them into another war. The First World War had devastated their country. So nothing of that. Hitler did not reveal his true colours to the people. The same too about his hatred of the Jews. Very little in his speeches about the fact he hated the Jews. He mentioned the Jews. People knew he disliked the Jews, but nothing, no mention, and probably Hitler didn't even know in his own mind about what he would eventually do with the Jews in the war in terms of murdering them. So his speech was relatively toned down and focuses on the type of things that would win the party's support. Above all else, he focused on the fact that the Communist Party were a grave threat to Germany. Remember, communism is international. Communism is workers of the world uniting. And so Hitler's pitch was that the communists were outsiders who were trying to divide Germany, to pull the German workers away from Germany. And Hitler's message is, no, all Germans must pull together, and there's only one party that can do that, and that is the Nazi Party. That the Nazis were different from any other political party because they represented all Germans. They were a party of all Germans. You take any other political party, the Social Democrats only represented the German working classes. The German Nationalist Party only represented the well-off Germans. The Catholic Centre Party only represented the German Catholics, whereas Hitler's message was, vote for the Nazis, you are voting for a party that represents all Germans and therefore will create unity. And from unity there will be strong government, because we are the only party who are capable of crushing communism. And why that? We said that last time. The businessmen in particular were attracted because the Nazis had a private army, 2 million strong, that could be used to crush communism. So the election campaign, no time was wasted. Hitler's got 5 weeks to take this message to the people. Joseph Goebbels, who is pictured here, was given the job of leading the propaganda campaign. Now, his position has now changed. Up until now, he's been a propaganda chief. Now, Hitler gave him a job in government. He actually created a ministry called the Ministry of Propaganda, so that whose job was effectively to sell the Nazi message to the German people. So there was a storm of Nazi propaganda that was unleashed in February 1933. The constant barrage of messages to the Germans that the communists were an enemy, vote for the Nazis, the mass rallies, all of those things that we've looked at that had been happening since the middle of the 1920s continued, but on a much grander scale. Football stadiums were no longer big enough to campaign. Hitler had to take huge fields to hold his mass rallies, leaflets, continuing to use the planes for flights over Germany, and above all making really good use of the radio now that he's Chancellor. He's got access to the radio. But the real distinctive feature of these election campaigns was the fact that the Nazis were now starting to use violence much more so than they've done in the past. Remember, Hitler had to previously tell the SA, calm down. There was always the risk that Hitler was going to get sent back to Austria, that the Nazis effectively could be banned, as had happened 10 years earlier. But Hitler's no longer worried about that, so the SA were basically given free rein to use violence against the communists, against the German communists. It was a very distinctive feature of this election campaign. Now, a week before the election, something incredibly useful for the Nazis happened. The Reichstag was burned down by a communist called Marius van der Lubbe. That was an astonishing stroke of luck for Hitler because, of course, for the previous 4 weeks, Hitler's message had been that the communists were trying to destroy Germany. So Hitler jumped onto this event and said, there's the proof. And he claimed to the German people that the Reichstag Fire was a signal to the Communist Party of Germany to begin a revolution, to actually violently seize power. And so Hitler cried out, this is it is a state of emergency, we have got to stop it, the communists are about to violently take power. It was so useful to Hitler that for many years afterwards people assumed that the Nazis had actually burned down the Reichstag themselves and blamed it on the communists, although actually the evidence is now that it was genuinely luck. Marius van der Lubbe was a communist, he burned down the fire. He burnt down the Reichstag. There's no evidence, though, that he was working as part of a conspiracy, that he was taking orders from the Communist Party. There's no evidence that there was a plot. But that doesn't matter. Hitler claimed it was part of a communist plot, and he took full advantage of it. What did he do? Okay, well, enormously important, this. Remember Article 48? Gave Hitler, had been used by previous chancellors, particularly Brüning since 1930, to get laws signed off by the president. Well, Hitler was no different. He had that power. He had the right, by Article 48, to get laws passed. The Reichstag had been closed down 4 weeks earlier. It's the middle of an election campaign. So Hitler said, we can't wait to deal with this. I can't wait for the Reichstag to be elected. I need an emergency law passed. So using Article 48, he went straight to President Hindenburg. He drafted a law and he said, you need to sign it off. Now remember, a law that is signed off, or a proposed law that is signed off by Article 48, is called a decree. And this decree, often called the Reichstag Fire Decree, its full title is the Decree for the Protection of People of State. So learn that full title. What powers did it give Hitler to do? Well, Hindenburg signed it. Hindenburg completely fell for the lie. Hitler claimed, this is an emergency, the communists are about to take power, you've got to give me the powers to do 2 things. And the first thing was to arrest people at will, and the second thing was to bring policing into the control of the government of Berlin. Remember, there were 25 different police forces in Germany. Each police force was controlled by the separate state governments, like local governments. Hitler did not control the state governments, he controls the central government in Berlin, so he needed to get policing under his control, and the Reichstag Fire Decree gave those powers to Hitler. Hindenburg's intention was that the decree would only last for as long as there was a communist threat. Unfortunately, Hitler worded the decree very, very carefully. It did not specify a communist threat, it simply said the Chancellor has got the powers to arrest people at will because there is a state of emergency. So Hitler could actually arrest whoever he wanted by the powers given to him by the Reichstag Fire decree. And the second thing which Hitler played very well is in the small print it said that the ending of the decree, when the time of emergency finishes, will be decided by the Chancellor. Of course, what it should have said is the President. But it didn't say that. It gave the power to the Chancellor, Hitler himself, to decide when the time of emergency would come to an end, and therefore when the emergency decree would end. Of course, Hitler never ended the time of emergency, and therefore the decree continued to be in force for as long as Hitler wanted it. And it was still in force in April 1945, the day that Hitler died. So the Reichstag Fire decree, enormously important because it provided the basis for Hitler's dictatorship. It was exactly a week before the election. When the elections were held, without surprise really, the Nazi vote increased. They went from 196 to 288 seats. In spite of that, they did not get a majority. They only got 44% of the vote. Enormously powerful, yes. If you look at the graph at the bottom, you can see how powerful the Nazi Party were. By far the largest party. They did not have a majority, but if you add on to the next to them, the DNVP, who are called the German Nationalist Party, very close to the Nazis, very sympathetic to the Nazis, those two parties between them, Hitler just got 51% of the seats. So he could now pass laws by himself. But however, it meant that the German Nationalist Party had to vote with him, and Hitler was therefore dependent on them. He was still a coalition chancellor. Factual test on the last two slides. Pause this podcast, run through it. There are a total 22 questions. The answers are on Frog. I'll be uploading those to a Frog folder in the next 24 hours. Hope that podcast was useful to you. The third podcast, please go to that, and that will be about the Enabling Act. Thank you.